the world the world has become so unpredictable, that the world has become so turbulent that we don't know what it's going to look like. Leave the next 20 years, in the next 18 months, 24 months, or whatever happens down the line. And this is because even in Africa, there are shifting structural conditions at
Mm.
both the regional level, but more importantly, at the domestic level. So we don't know what a Southern African regional community will look like in the next 18 to 24 months, because at the domestic level, structural changes are happening so rapidly in terms of elections, in terms of governance, in terms of regional economic communities, in terms of one of the things that we haven't really talked about in much of the discussions under the G20, although it's part of the agenda of the G20, is this question of climate change and how climate change is going to reconfigure the actual architecture of the nation state. So in many ways, that's why I think it's an opportunity and a threat at the same time. It's that juxtaposition. Because if we don't understand what the world is systemically looking like and where we are going, very much like the Gramsci quote, old is dying, new is yet to be born. But for me, it is the morbidity of consequences that we are fundamentally in,
Mm.
which is part of that quote. And of course, the other part of the quote, which doesn't get popularized as much as the morbidity of consequences, is the fact that you also have the rise of monsters in the
Uh-huh.
international system. So in that context of monsters, I think we have to understand that at the governance level, and your point about whether the G20 is a legally binding or enforceable um, framework, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not, because the bigger challenge of the G20 is how do you find consensus? And so if we link that consensus point to the agency in the G20 for Africa, I think those are the twin problems of Africa in
Mm.
many ways for itself. Because it's not about whether the G20 offers you the agency or whether the G20 offers you the consensus. We find the difficulty in Africa just based on the work that your organization does and the work that at Bob's organization does, and then many organizations represented here today on this platform, is the governance weaknesses, the governance challenges
Yeah.
around how do you get consensus. But
Mm.
consensus means you also have to think about agency. So before we start to jump, leap, and skip into the G20, we haven't achieved that in the context of Africa, because Africa is still grappling with, you know, political leaders who don't know when they have to leave office, or
Yeah.
their shelf life becomes an expiry date that just continues, or you have a disconnect between what leaders are doing and how they are actually articulating the African agency on the global stage and in the continent and at the regional level, which is not synchronizing or synergetic with the expectations of ordinary citizens. So this is where I
Okay.
find it very interesting. Just last point, Chair, is
Yeah.
what South Africa has done with the theme is to actually talk about an international system that is fundamentally flawed because it doesn't create inclusivity, it doesn't create equality, and it's certainly not sustainable. But
Mm.
where it's interesting is that the two tracks in the G20, the Sherpa track and the finance track, are actually in kind of contestation with each other, because the
Mm.
Sherpa track is really where it talks to the people. And this is where Africa's agency on citizenship and citizenry becomes interesting, because it's about social justice struggles and it's about inclusion. It's about the impact of debt, the impact of the cost of capital, the borrowing, etc., on the social justice and lives and livelihoods of ordinary people. And then, of course, the finance track is in direct opposition to that, because it still wants to keep the conservatism of
Mm.
monetary policy, a financial system that is still of old, that keeps the conservatism and the independence of the growth-led model and all of that, which doesn't create even a trickle-down effect. So we're in an existential crisis around the
Mm.
fact that the G20 is actually being challenged by a model that is actually in a crisis in itself. And it's that model that we are now challenging because it's not delivering for
Mm.
everybody.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for that. I was quite interested in the term that you used there from that quote, the morbidity of consequences. For those of you who are students of international relations and all of that, think about that next time. We're going to cycle back to this issue, the issues that you're mentioning now. But I just want to zone in for a few seconds, if I may, Sanusha, on the issue that you touched a little bit on. This theme, what does it mean to you, this theme of advancing solidarity, equality, and sustainability? What makes this important as a theme to be discussed in the G20 for us, but also as in the continent as a whole?
So there's two ways in which this theme becomes kind of ventilated. One is that the international system has never been about solidarity. It's never been about sustainability or equality or even inclusivity. And it's about how do you bring those peripheral countries, the peripheral states, how countries that have been marginalized from an international system, how do you bring them into this whole kind of architecture and ecosystem of the global economy, but also the kind of multilateralism. So as much as you talk multilateralism, there's a lot of exclusivity. On the other hand, it's also about creating that solidarity in the African context. This is my interpretation. How do you create the solidarity of speaking with one voice, aligning to the kind of African ambitions, goals, etc., whether it's under the ACFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or whether it is around the fact that you can have an agency where you're talking about Africa first, not necessarily African states first. It's that kind of dynamic of navigating those two kind of very interesting forks in the road, which is really where you bring it together. And that's the challenge. I think the challenge is that the theme in itself is about a world which not that is built on a system of an international system that is really very competitive, very exclusive, very about national interest, and so forth. And we're seeing this with the Trump presidency around unilateralism and multilateralism and bilateralism and this kind of fatalistic approach and no free riders in the system. I'm tired of that. We will not be the free ride. We will not support the free riders. On the other hand, it is about that inclusivity, whether it's more than just getting a seat at the table, how do you influence outcomes, etc. But before you start to get to that, you've got to create it at home first.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to come to you now, Dr. Kawesi, but I just want to tie this little loop here, Bob, which is about the fact that the US at the senior level have indicated in one way or the other lack of interest in attending the G20 in South Africa. What implication does that have in your view about the quality of this G20 summit and the outcomes thereof?
No, I think there are again various perspectives on this, and maybe one can touch on several of these perspectives. On the one hand, this spells quite some, for lack of a better word, some doom for the G20 in a sense. This is one extreme, because what it means is that the US is going on with its dismissal of global mechanisms that serve as platforms for discussion of the pressing issues that face the world. Even as, and I like Sanusha's framing of this, even as there are very major disagreements, there are major asymmetries and so forth, but at least talking is not too bad to start off. At least you can lay these issues on the table. So if the US is not very enthusiastic, not keen at all, then it spells doom for these multilateral platforms. Remember that the G20 started off in response to the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s. It weighed in quite a bit during the international financial crisis of the late 2000s, and even though not perfect, it helped in some form of reset of global financial institutions, not to the agreement, to the consensus, to the enthusiasm from Africans and other, global South institutions, but still, it has tried to weigh in on those issues. In fact, the finance track within the G20 has always been considered where the rubber meets the road, as it were. So the fact that the US is the largest economy in the world, even though it is considered on shaky ground, but it's on shaky ground from high above. Yeah. And of course, when the US doesn't, show up for events like this, many other countries watch quite keenly. Are they not just their non-attendance? Is it an indication that if we attend and are enthusiastic, we are going to be hammered with tariffs of 30% and above, and so forth? And then, of course, on the other hand, this might actually just serve the reverse. And I think as analysts, we might want to look at that. It might actually embolden all these discussions and strategies around the global South. Is it then going to be that the G20 increasingly is bolstered by the global South, the likes of China, India, Brazil, and so forth? The BRICS countries, and the BRICS formation has been expanding, might then begin to play a bigger role in the G20, or at least notch up compared to the global North powers in there, which, from an African perspective, by the way, are already under siege. France itself has huge problems in West Africa and the Sahel. Because of Trump's bad relations with Western Europe, they have also cut down the involvement in matters of security and so forth on the continent. So I think we should actually be very keen to analyze the non-appearance, the non-participation of the US, not so much from an emotional perspective, but what it means for an institution such as that, which is already, by the way, withdrawing from UN agencies. They have left the UN Human Rights Council. Just yesterday, they left UNESCO and so forth. I think I'll stop there for now.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that. This is a fascinating conversation. I think Sanusha framed it quite well when she was talking about the 80-year to 100-year sort of global shifting moments. I think it sounds like we are at that moment, Dr. Kawese. Again, welcome to you. Now, in the context of that, can I just ask this question to you, if you don't mind opening your video, if you can, but if you can, we can understand. What does genuine African agency within the G20 framework look like? And how far are we, in your opinion, towards achieving this agency? Given the fact that now even the African Union has a seat at the table, how are we using the agency that we have?
Thank you so much, Patrick, for steering us through this discussion. And I'm glad that Bob had to speak before me, because I've variously told him that our problem within the larger scheme of things that are the African agency is that we are somehow very talkative. And it is usually required of us to reflect on even why we are talking. First of all, about the G20, but also those that have worked so hard to be where they are, like the United States. You can't complain about them. They have taken their hard work so seriously, and that is where they are, that they can hold all of us at a ransom. In other words, they are not attending. We are all being held at ransom so that we can concentrate on discussing on why they are not coming. We lose focus on the real issues that are taking place, but we discuss those that have decided not to come. Let me, because it is evening time in Uganda, we usually try as much as possible to make discussions softer, okay? Not the hard scholarly stuff that usually comes with the words of the academy.
That's the idea. That's the idea, Doc.
Yeah. So let me dramatize for you what we're exactly discussing at the moment. A club of rich fellows, we are talking about the rich 20, isn't it? A club of rich fellows who took their hard work and intelligence so seriously have suggested that they will sit in South Africa to celebrate their fortunes, but also to reflect on the challenges that are against their fortunes. That is exactly what the G20 that is going to sit in South Africa is going to do. Rich guys finding some time to sit in South Africa to reflect on their fortunes, but also on the challenges to their fortunes. What exactly is going to happen to those that are not necessarily part of that club? It means that your fate will either be a matter of sympathy or a matter that will make them to appear so stronger because you are where you are at the moment. You are poor, disenfranchised, almost stupid in a sense. In other words, you enhance their strength.
Doc, are you there? I was listening very, very, very interestingly to what Dr. Kawesu was saying. We just lost him, unfortunately, when he was right at the most important part, when he was talking about, if I heard him correctly, rich pharaohs meeting in South Africa. Wipilo says, very powerful reawakening. He was talking about these rich pharaohs coming to South Africa to sit and reflect on their fortunes and discuss the future of the challenges to their fortune. And it sounds as if he was saying they are coming here to enhance those fortunes even more. Wow, wow. Doc, can you hear me? Are you back?
Let me sustain that dramatization a little bit further.
Please go ahead.
That they may as well at the end of the conference pop a champagne about the kind of schemes which they have planned against you and me, and then the next meeting will be to see how they can actualize those particular schemes. The point which I'm making is as simple as this. Beyond the theorization of the African agency and the dramatization of the world order, the practical issue which we should contend with as far as the African agency is concerned, how do we empower Africans? And who are the Africans in this regard? We are referring to the Africans of North, those are our leaders. The Africans of Little North, those are the citizens of Africa. For me, it's no shortcut, and I've variously argued, so long as Africans remain talkative but less practical, we are just wasting our time. Let me give you a very simple example that perhaps may even require that we do not concentrate so much on discussing the rich. We have enough problems within us which we need to sort out as quickly as possible. By the indicators of Mo Ibrahim, every year, annually, $100 billion are siphoned through corruption. The economy of Kenya, where my brother Bob hails from, the economy of Kenya, at least conservatively, is $116.66 billion. In others, annually, we eat, if I may use the language of Africans, okay, we eat almost the entire economy of Kenya through corruption. So do you want to suggest that the Americans somehow, through all sorts of vaccines, vaccinated us with that bag of corruption, that we are eating the Kenyan economy? It's the sub-Saharan level of corruption is 100 billion every year. So we eat as Africans, and particularly Africans of North, the leaders, okay, through corruption, they deny us all sorts of things that may have empowered the African agency by taking this amount of money through self-aggrandizement. Then the question would be, and someone has put it there, how do we empower Africans? So what exactly have I communicated? Of course, I'll take off some time to respond to that question later.
Yes.
What you have done as the Good Governance, is it the Good Governance Network?
Good Governance Africa.
Yeah, what you have done as Good Governance Africa, what you are doing as the African Study for the United States, and the fact that Bob took off some time to alert me ahead of time, that will make an appearance at this discussion. It is very wonderful, wonderful. It is extremely wonderful, except that we must be very clear on the kind of discussions, on the kind of talk which we pursue. Is it a talk of empowerment or a talk of too much cry, okay? Or a talk of too much attraction of sympathy and pity? Why have they decided to sit in South Africa? What exactly happened to South Africa that has made them to come to South Africa, but they are not making any attempt whatsoever to come and sit in Uganda, Kampala, sometime in the future? We need to appreciate the fact that there is usually some hard work that goes into the question of empowerment. South Africa is not Mozambique. South Africa is not Malawi. South Africa is not Zimbabwe. Much as they are located within the same region of our continent. What exactly did South Africa do? Of course, we may decry the history and the heritage of the South African economy. That can also be discussed, but it shouldn't be part of this discussion. We are saying there is too much hard work that went into that economy. There is too much hard work that has gone into the economy of Turkey. 10 years back, Turkey was the sick man of Europe, the sick man of that civilization. But now when you think about Turkey, that it's turning around the fortunes of Uganda, even in Somalia, we no longer matter. We did much in Somalia, but now they are talking about the Turkish. What exactly have the Turkish brought on board that have given them too much agency? You look at all those that are part of the G20, they're only reminding us that we need to think, we need to work hard, we need to harness our intelligence. No society owes others a living. If the Americans are not coming to the G20, much as it is sitting in South Africa, it shouldn't be our business. Our business should be, how do we make sure that all African states become what the G20 are at the moment? I think that could be the larger discussion.
Okay, Doc, I think you've spoken a mouthful, and I still think that there's more that we're gonna tease out from what you are saying. But wow, I see that what you're saying was really, really activating a lot of thinking here. I see Makati Mema says here that is the main point. How do we empower Africans? We have a lot of problems that we need to focus on and deal with united. And then Kennedy Manduna says, Dr. Kawesi, I think it's at this stage where it's important to pose Lenin's century-old critical question: what needs to be done? Where to start? I think this is very important. I'm going to give you now, Boipelo, but I just want my panel to you can come in at whatever way you want. But let me put this question: how, in the light of what Dr. Kawesi just said now, how can Africa move from being policy takers to be policy shapers in global issues? Because for now, we're receiving the G20, they're coming to us, even our agenda sometimes gets questioned. How do we become policy makers and policy shapers rather than policy takers? Let me just come to you, Boipelo. You can come in at this point, and then I'll come to Sanusha in that order, please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this platform. Firstly, I would say that, the strategic governance repositioning of South Africa is a placement for Africa as a whole, which ultimately must be recording the following key points as I have followed it through the theme of solidarity and equality and sustainability. I think South Africa as the leader for Africa should be enhancing social issues that covers the African countries, first and foremost. And secondly, that South Africa visibility and executive orientation to uplift the continent by setting economic momentum. Thirdly, I would say that South Africa must be celebrated for its diversity to then signify the power of influence entailing pillars of governance. And fourth, I would say that South Africa historically must claim victory into reshaping the market of Africa. And then I would say again that South Africa must have the embodiment of a unifier, a leader, an ownership, a development, and social emblem of the spirit of Ubuntu. And lastly, most importantly, South Africa must be the economy shifter.
Wow, thank you, Boipilo. Thank you so much for those points. I think there's a lot to tease out even there. Now, let me come to you, Miss Naidu. Let's come to you right now. I think your hand was up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's contributed, especially Dr. Kawezi. I think he's raised some very important points. And it circles back to this issue of, what is the G20? And why the G20 is suddenly pivoting in the way that it is pivoting. And suddenly there's a whole lot of excitement and frenzy that it's in Africa for the first time. My first point is, I don't think Africa should actually try to reconstitute itself in the eyes and the image of the G20. Because once you do that, you're actually taking on the crisis of the international system into your ecosystem. The G20 was formed, as Bob rightly pointed out, in response to crises. In response to the Asian crisis of 1997-98, and then it evolved into subsequent mini-laterals at the finance minister's level, and then elevated to a heads of state, because there was a crisis in a part of the world where it needed to have a kind of systematic approach and response, and it became a heads of state G20 after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. By tracking that in terms of how the G20 evolves, gives us a sense that the G20 is evolving on the basis of crisis response. It's not about dealing with the crisis. It's not about looking at, to use the quote of Gramsci again, the morbidity of the consequences. Because it is reacting to something that is systematically flawed, contradicted in the international system. And therefore, the agency of the G20 should not be the type of agency Africa wants to purport or even to try and define for itself. Africa has enough of that agency based on how much the world needs Africa. In the context of suddenly now we're finding ourselves once again in the spotlight of the international system. But that spotlight is because we have what the world wants from us. It wants the critical minerals, because the critical minerals become part of the bigger existential conflict that is happening between the USA and China. We becoming, and of course, let's not forget, it's not just the competing interests of these major actors that we are citing today. It's a whole number of different actors that are coming into the fold. It's not just about the USA and China. It's about the Gulf states. It's about Turkey, in a sense. It's about the fact that our peace that should be negotiated and stability and security that should be the serious view that should be negotiated in Addis Ababa or negotiated by the AU in the Peace and Security Council is not being negotiated there. It's being negotiated by Qatar. So already you've given your agency up to somebody else to negotiate your peace, your security, your stability. And that in itself means that the question of why is the G20 happening and why the G20 should be able to advance, enhance, and create a level of agency for Africa, only Africa can create that agency for itself. Nobody else can do that. Whether you talk about it in the context of, why this and why that, the end of the day is, if 90% or more than 75% of your peace and security budget comes from the outside, you don't have agency over and control over your peace and security resources. So what we are now seeing is the turbulent world that we find ourselves in is actually now playing a much more deeper role of internal contestation in Africa around this question of, should it be South Africa? Should it be this? No. For the longest time, and let me give you this example of where agency has also become compromised in the African context beyond the G20. Let's leave the G20 in the periphery for a moment. When AGOA gets reviewed in September this year, we must basically free ourselves from the notion that AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, will be renewed for Africa's interest. It won't. Because you can't use your agency and outsource your development to somebody else. AGOA is a preferential market access. It is at the discretion of the US. And at such time that the US will pull it and decide they don't want it, you are now held hostage and ransom to another country's agency. So these are the curious things about how we think about and how we talk about things. If we're unwilling to call it like it is, then we should, in fact, then just pack up house and say, yes, Africa has always been for sale and it'll remain as an agency for outside actors. Because I think those are the problems, the internal dynamic of how these competing interests around countries in the continent are fighting each other, trying to get a share at that table, where the agency is falling short. The 5 countries that go into this mini-lateral with the White House, there's a regional bloc that could have been part of that discussion, but it wasn't. So what we have to now think about is agency is about what is your strategic value proposition and what do you want out of it. It can't be aspirational. As much as we love Agenda 2063, I don't know how many of us will still be alive when Agenda 2063 happens. But the point that I need to think about here is we have a constituency of young people, the only continent in the world that has a youth bulge, positive demographic profile. The rest of the world is aging. And if it's true that we in Africa are not finding the skills, the employment, and keeping these youth in Africa to be part of the skills development, part of the agency of the continent, and that that the young people are going to be looking to be working everywhere else. In other words, the report that the Economist did a few weeks or months ago is that Africa could become the labor workshop for the world. Young people will start migrating because other parts of the world don't have a workforce because of the aging demographics. What are we doing to keep young people here? So in a way, it's right. Your agency that you're negotiating, and it's not just in the G20, it's in the WTO, it's in the UN context, it is in Davos, because that's the other place you got to ask about the rich pharaohs that go to. Not the G20 only. Davos is meltdown. And those are where all the deals are made for the continent in respect of the elite. So we've got to be careful in how do we create that consensus in Africa around agency. It can't be that we're fighting each other because we want to basically get the best for ourselves and leave the rest by the wayside.
I note you there, Prof. I just want to indicate to the people that maybe have joined us late, we are having a conversation here in preparation of a conference called the Amplifying Voices, African Voices for Strategic Action. That conference is going to happen in November this year. And Dr. Bob is going to tell us a bit more about that. And so we've got a couple of speakers that have actually sketched the surface and really delved deep into some of the bigger issues. But there's this question that has come up, which is how do we empower Africans? And I think Sanusha started talking about young people, about empowering young people so that they don't migrate and swim and try to swim in raggedy boats across the oceans to go overseas. But also Kennedy has asked this question, what needs to be done? Where do we start? Now, Bob, can I just come back to you and then say, because we're going to come back to this issue, given the diversity of the voices that we're now hearing, and since we're all here not government, we are civil society, analysts and so on, how is the conference going to use its platform to amplify the voices so that what is being said here by Sanusha Naidu, Dr. Kawesi, yourselves, Makati, Wipelo, how are we going to use the conference to amplify those voices so that they matter? Because it's one thing for the governments to talk at that level, because for them, they sometimes enjoy being in the spotlight with Trump. They like the handshakes, but how is that relevant for us on the ground? Now, let me come back to you, Dr. Wekesa. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead.
I'm glad to weigh in at this point.
Yes.
Let me just start by saying I concur with my colleagues Tanusha and Kawesi. I wish I could differ with them, but I just don't find anything to differ with them on. But use this then opportunity to say that we strategically placed this conference just a day after the end of the Heads of State Summit. The Heads of State Summit is 22nd and 23rd. Strangely, it is over the weekend in Johannesburg. And then we'll just take a break on the Monday, 24th, and launch into the conference on the 25th, 26th, and 27th. And it's exactly this very tough, hard nuts to crack, hard questions to weigh in on that we want to look at. That the G20 heads of state came and they've read a resolution, there's a communique, all the way from Argentina to United Kingdom to and the AU and EU and so forth. They have agreed, they have wrapped up, they have gone their different ways. But what does that really mean in terms of African agency? In fact, in the practical terms, then we are looking at African agency from nearly the grassroots level, because we'll have let the heads of state have their time and ventilate, and then we weigh in to actually not only analyze but figure out the next steps. And I think one of the structural approaches then to this conference is that there are multiple issues. But how do you organize ideas that seem to splinter into many directions into a coherent whole? We have therefore put together 4 tracks in terms of thematic approaches, so that we can then not be just talkative, as Kawesi was saying, but talk and come up with action points, which is why we are calling this Amplifying African Voices for Strategic Action. Come up with resolutions of things we can do at our personal level, things that we can recommend and advocate and push leaders to kind of implement. And so this is in, the definition, the conceptualization of African agency itself. That's one theme. What is African agency? And I think my colleague, Dr. Kawesi and Sanusha, in some respects, have weighed in on that. In fact, I'll just add very quickly that when you think of African agency, for example, we might want to start at home, internally. Just an example in the peace and security sphere, the whole of the Great Lakes region, the Sahel region, the Horn of Africa is in major turmoil. So when can we talk, how do we start talking of African agency when we have civil strife, armed conflict, lots of refugees? You can't even start talking of, improving our agriculture or innovation in places like Eastern DRC or the Sudan and so forth. So, in that domain alone, we need to be thinking of that. So then, second, we have communicating African agency, which is essentially will be a theme around media, communications, use of digital platforms, social media. How do we use this to mobilize Africans of all ages to, kind of approach the world and their regions with confidence, rather than with optimism, rather than giving up and saying, no, look, Africa is a lost cause. There's no way we'll ever get out of the hole. There's no way we're ever going to be able to feed ourselves, to be at peace with ourselves, to integrate as a continent, to be as confident as the Chinese were in the early 80s when they started off very poor and actually, scratched up, like the Indians and where they have come from to develop and so forth. So the whole area of communication and how we can use the affordances of social media, conventional media and so forth will be key. Of course, AI is here today with us. We do not want to be left behind, but also we have to address digital divides and so forth. So that will be the second major theme. The third major theme will be on arts and culture. And there's a lot to say there. And obviously, South Africa, Nigeria, these are major countries in terms of cultural industries and so forth. But we are bleeding money because all the major global monopolies in the cultural industries sphere are from the global north. How do we ensure that then we crowd in this money? In fact, when we think of the bleeding of cultural capacity, so that we are, Burna Boy, for example, is a Nigerian, artist, but he doesn't, the royalties that come to him are a drop in the sea compared to what is derived by, say, Hollywood. In fact, just yesterday, Patrick, we heard that the French company called Canal Plus, is looking to buy MultiChoice, which has been an icon on the continent. And who owns the Canal Plus is Bolaro, I think, a French right-wing politician who promotes fascist kinds of ideas. And of course, when you look at the likes of Netflix and so forth, we are kind of conduits for profit making by others, and one can go on and on and on and on. In fact, I'll just mention on this particular one the fact that the South African Competition Commission, I think it's called, has been weighing in quite a bit on these digital platforms that come on the continent, purporting to be just platforms, but they are actually money minting organizations from Silicon Valley that don't report their profits here and so forth. And finally, I think we'll have a panel on global affairs and geopolitics. Of course, this is where we are talking of the world is shifting. How do we position ourselves as Africans, not to end up impacted negatively, but to seize the moment, to see if we can, in fact, scratch up, do better in the world, maybe starting with ideas that work continentally and going forward. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. We are fast approaching past, so I don't want us to move to continue beyond that. But the conversation is fascinating, and I want us to draw our attention, Dr. Kaweesi, at this point towards the very points that you made. I think you made the point, which is the empowerment of Africans. I found it interesting that you then talked about Africans of note, and then Africans of little note. And then you said the Africans of note are our leaders, and Africans of little note are us. Tell us, how can we empower Africans, whether they are Africans of note or Africans of little note? What needs to be done practically? And as Kennedy said, where do we start?
Thank you so much, Patrick and Bob and Sanusha, for the discourse which you have put across. I began from the idea that evening time in the context of Uganda is for softer narratives, okay? So that the evening can go so well. So let me also bring out what is so unique about South Africa when it comes to the question of the African agents, perhaps to zoom into what needs to be done. so that we can be formidable in a sense as Africans. In the year 2010, South Africa hosted the World Cup, a very joyful moment in the history of our continent. I remember, I don't know whether those are the particular words that Mzee Mandela suggested, that I am now ready to die. It was a very jovial moment. And the idea was that this century is for Africa, and that is how that song that animated that event, that this is Africa, we are Africans, and we are now determined to fly. Okay. So shortly after that, in 2012. We were afforded a fellowship in India, and Indians joined that kind of rhetoric which we had started in South Africa, that this century is for Asia and Africa. We are all mobilized. We are very enthusiastic about that. The analogy which I want to bring out is as simple as this. In the year 2012, after that major claim that the century is going to be ours, India made a firm landing on the moon to advance their science. Africans were still dying of hunger. If you look at those two things, which were all anchored on the claim that the century is going to be for Asia and Africa, Asia has since then transformed. Outside South Africa, outside a few localities on our country, the struggle continues. In Latin, they say "a ruta continua," but the Kenyans have a firm phrase for that it is not yet uhuru for majority of Africans. It is not yet independence in a sense. There are many things that can be imagined, and I'm glad that colleagues picked onto the narrative that we need to discuss how we can empower what I usually refer to as the African self. How do we empower the African self? Many suggestions have been made. But I always tell people that despite our emotions, okay, the misgivings which we may be having about the West, the misgiving which we may be having against all those that have seen the light of the day to become rich, even after exploiting us, we need to thoroughly reflect on what they have done to be where they are. What have exactly the Indians done? They may not have reached where they want to be, but it seems to me their trajectory, okay, their trajectory is marvelous. When you look at Indonesia, Indonesia was colonized for more than 200 years by the Netherlanders. And at the moment they can have a table, okay, they can have a seat on the table of those who are saying that we are also almost there. We are almost there if you haven't arrived. In other words, the many things which have declined for so long, such as colonialism, the unfairness of the West, it seems to me they are tired and somehow becoming useless. The journey of rising, it has been indicated by others. It begins with your determination, to harness your hard work and intelligence. And it seems to me we are not yet there. Even though Sanusha has suggested that we have many young people, those young people, promise a lot of fortunes to Africa, until you also dig deep and see whether you have empowered them to make a firm contribution to the advancement of our continent. Farm education is lacking on this continent for majority of our people. Most of our people are grappling with all sorts of diseases. These young people are so much disappointed that the next crisis we shall have to grapple with was certainly talked about by Kaplan. The next crisis will certainly be how we are going to address the question of drugs, that out of disappointment, majority of young people are feeding themselves on. So the crisis, even amongst the youth, is deeper. In fact, as we celebrate the population of the youth that could be promising many fortunes, we must also reflect the caliber of youths which we have in Africa and how better prepared they are to be part of the journey of African empowerment. So without belaboring the point, and this I have even put elsewhere, even in print, my suggestion has been for all that have seen the light of the day, to be afforded a table, or rather a chair on the table of all those that matter. One thing for sure has been a subject to their intelligence and hard work: the journey to farm industrialization. We cannot celebrate so much when young people will be migrating elsewhere to serve, to promote the industrial potentialities of others. How come if they are to stay there to turn into our continent into the workshop of the world? So that what the Chinese are doing to the world at the moment, we do it in Africa. You see, there is no glory in having your people going to other lands. There is no celebration in that. Yet ideally they are supposed to be territorially trapped. Where they are, they harness their potential so that you move outside with a bang. You don't move out to the outside as the weak. You move outside with a bang. We are fully industrialized. Our goods are all over the place. Yes, you can have all sorts of tariffs to stop our goods, but you cannot, because they are part of the critical needs which you need. The West found itself in that kind of catch-22. You do not. You are worried that the Chinese are all over the world as far as their goods are concerned, but you need those goods. During COVID-19, that came out fairly strongly. That yes, the Chinese are doing many things that are undermining your legacy. All sorts of people will be concerned when their civilizations are warning simply because other civilizations are rising. That will always be a legitimate concern of the powerful. So the issue of concern should be, there has never been a society that has ever seen the light of the day without taking industrialization seriously. And then the next discussion will be, how do we harness that important facet of all civilizations that have become of note? How do we harness industrialization? And from there we can generate as many talking points as possible. And of course, you had asked me also to say something about those that are classified as Africans of note and Africans of lesser note.
Yeah, in a minute.
In a minute. The Africans of a lesser note, I mean, it is, I shouldn't say that it is you and me, but we can say we are part of the fault. I am more interested to say something about the Africans of note. They are the problem, but they are also part of the solution we are supposed to have. They are not getting the priorities in the right order. Their rhetoric is not necessarily balanced with the practicalities of what is required. Actually, all African leaders, when you look at the kind of speeches which they have been making on any platform of the world, appreciate the fact that we must take our industrialization seriously. But how come in all the things which they do, they seem not to be pointing clearly in that direction? And that is how, and perhaps I wasn't understood so well. That is why I said that South Africa is hosting the African, rather the G20, for the simple fact that South Africa, for quite a long period of time, they have harnessed their industrialization. In other words, others can take South Africa seriously